In January 2025, a dense mist with a chemical odor slowly drifted through neighborhoods in at least 4 U.S. states, surprising local authorities and putting residents on alert. The phenomenon occurred on consecutive days, almost always in the early hours of the morning, when the streets were still empty and security cameras captured the opaque air covering avenues, parks, and residential areas. Within hours, reports began to appear on online forums and neighborhood apps. People described symptoms similar to a sudden flu, mild fever, headache, a feeling of confusion, and eye irritation. Pressured to respond, the CDC stated that weather conditions had trapped pollutant particles near the ground, creating an inversion effect. But what exactly was in that fog? As the reports spread, short videos emerged showing drones flying over the areas moments before the mist appeared. In one clip, recorded in Colorado, the device seemed to release a white trail as it hovered motionless for a few seconds. The footage was taken down less than 24 hours later. The pattern was strange, but familiar to those who had studied records of Operation Sea Spray, a real experiment conducted by the U.S. Army in the 1950s, which involved releasing bacteria over San Francisco without public knowledge. Faced with so many coincidences, one question became inevitable. Was the chemical fog case merely a weather phenomenon, or a silent rehearsal for a covert operation? Welcome to another night, where mysteries never sleep. I'm Midnight, and this is 7 Nights. Before we begin, I want to ask for your help. Like the video, comment, and subscribe to the channel. It's just one click, but it makes a huge difference in helping YouTube deliver the videos to more people and in allowing me to keep bringing this content to you. I'm counting on you. Let's get into the video. Let's start at the beginning. On January 6, 2025, residents of Fresno, California, noticed something strange at dawn. A thick, gray, motionless fog blanketed the streets, rooftops, and even open fields. But this wasn't ordinary fog. It appeared out of nowhere, without rain, without high humidity, and without any meteorological warning. And what stood out most was the smell, a strong chemical odor, described by several residents as something between bleach and rust. This might have been an isolated case, if it hadn't repeated itself. On the same day, similar reports emerged in Texas, Arizona, and even Colorado, regions with different climates. Yet the fog followed the same pattern. It appeared around 5 a.m., remained motionless for about an hour, and then vanished without a trace, except for a wave of symptoms among residents: mild fever, nausea, headache, and a strange sense of disorientation. If it were a natural phenomenon, how could this perfectly timed repetition be explained? And that's where the strangest detail begins: the videos. Several residents filmed the shrouded streets. Some used drones, others simply recorded from their windows. These videos circulated on social media for a few hours and disappeared. They weren't just deleted. They vanished simultaneously across different platforms. Profiles were suspended, links broke, and those who reposted received automatic violation warnings. But what kind of violation is it to show a fog-covered street? I saw some of these videos before they were taken down. One of them showed an entire neighborhood covered by the mist at 5:12 a.m., and what appeared to be a beam of light slicing through the air for a few seconds. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't a car. The video was posted by a small gardening channel with only 400 subscribers. In less than 2 hours, the channel was suspended. And this happened to others too. Anyone trying to document it was silenced. Why would a natural fog cause this kind of mass reaction? The official explanation came quickly. The National Weather Service claimed it was all a thermal inversion. But hold on. Thermal inversions do exist and can trap pollutants near the ground. But they don't appear out of nowhere in such distant cities with the same duration and timing pattern, much less with the smell of industrial chemicals. It's as if someone took a real phenomenon and used it as a ready-made excuse. Would you accept that answer so easily? Local newspapers even tried to investigate. One in Kansas City published a note about an increase in mild respiratory cases. The article mentioned the fog. It was published one day and removed the next. No corrección, no retracción. Just gone. What justifies the disappearance of a simple news piece with verified data and interviews with local doctors? Another detail almost went unnoticed. Doctors who treated the first cases in public hospitals reported, off the record, that they received instructions not to use terms like chemical reaction or environmental contamination in medical records. Instead, they used unspecified viral infection. In other words, all cases were classified as if they were the flu, even when there was no fever nor a typical infectious condition. Who would be interested in keeping all medical records so neutral? And it doesn't stop there. When searching for these occurrences on engines like Google, the results were shallow. Many pages had been de-indexed. Those searching for Chemical Fog 2025 were directed to articles about wildfire smoke, even in states where no fires had occurred. I had to use alternative search engines and archived forums to piece together a coherent timeline. But why so many obstacles to access something that was supposedly natural? All of this reminded me of a real case, Operation Sea Spray in the 1950s, when the US government released bacteria over San Francisco to test population vulnerabilities. Without telling anyone, it only came to light decades later through declassified documents. And back then, the symptoms were also mild, diffuse, easy to confuse with the flu. Coincidence? This is where the question shifts in tone. It's no longer just about what that fog was. The real question is, why in the year 2025 are events of this scale still being covered by silence, erasure, and inconsistent narratives? Now comes a part of the story that caught my attention from the very beginning. In more than one recording made by residents, the ones that leaked before being deleted, small luminous dots can be seen in the sky, hovering over the neighborhoods covered by the mist. They weren't planes nor helicopters. They were drones. And when I began to cross-reference dates and times with public air traffic data, I noticed something even stranger. These flights simply weren't recorded anywhere. It sounds like something out of a movie, but the data is clear. Every drone operated in urban space in the United States, even commercial ones, must be registered with the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. And there are accessible databases where anyone can check air traffic activity, including licensed drones. But at the times when residents reported the lights in the sky, and when the videos show formations hovering over neighborhoods, there were no authorized flights. None. In one recording made in Arizona, you can clearly see an object hovering for almost 2 minutes over a row of houses. It doesn't blink like a typical delivery drone and remains completely still. The video was analyzed by an electronics engineer consulted by a video analysis channel, and he noted that the object appeared to use active stabilization, a technology common in military or high-performance industrial drones. But what would a drone like that be doing over a residential area at 5 a.m.? Some residents tried to report the sightings to local authorities, but the reports weren't taken seriously. In 2 documented cases, the records made at police stations weren't even properly filed. They disappeared from internal systems. When pressed, authorities claimed there wasn't enough evidence that the objects were drones. But isn't it curious that, at the same time, security camera footage was systematically being removed from social media? We know that, technically, it's possible to use drones for aerial dispersion. This is no longer science fiction. Since 2017, there have been prototypes of agricultural drones capable of spraying entire areas with precision. They are commonly used in China, Japan, and even the US. So the question isn't whether this can be done. It's, did someone do it? And why? And if you think this sounds too absurd, it's worth remembering that DARPA itself, the Advanced Research Agency of the US Department of Defense, has already developed autonomous drone systems for urban environments. There are official documents showing tests in controlled zones. What prevents the use of these systems in real operations, with less clear purposes? One detail that caught my attention was the pattern of the flyovers. The drones didn't cross the sky in straight lines. They hovered. Sometimes they stayed still for minutes, as if waiting for something. In one case recorded in Amarillo, Texas, 2 nearby home cameras filmed the same object hovering between houses. This isn't normal behavior for recreational or commercial drones. Why stay still, almost hidden, above a quiet and sleeping neighborhood? I found no official explanation for this. No open investigation. No press conference addressing the presence of these objects. It's as if the authorities skipped that part completely. They talked about the mist. They talked about the weather. But they ignored what hundreds of people saw in the sky. Does that make sense to you? Another worrying aspect is the silence from tech companies. Some of the images seem to have been captured by smart home cameras, the kind that automatically save to the cloud. Users reported that their files were deleted or became inaccessible right after the events. They contacted tech support, but we're told there was a server error. Only on those days? Only during those hours? Only in those cities? The most curious thing is that the drones, when they appear, always seem to precede the arrival of the mist. Never after, never during, always before, as if they were a preparatory step. And this raises a disturbing hypothesis. What if the mist wasn't caused by natural conditions, but by a deliberate, coordinated action using unidentified aerial equipment? From this point on, the theory stops being just about a strange weather phenomenon. It starts to look like an operation. Who would be behind this, and for what purpose so silent, so precise, so invisible? The mist itself was already strange. The drones even more so. But one of the aspects that made me look at this case more closely was the clinical pattern of the reports. People who had never met, living hundreds of miles apart, began reporting the same symptoms within the same time windows. And we're not talking about generic coincidences like, I felt sick, or I had some discomfort. These were specific descriptions: sudden headache, mild fever, burning eyes, nausea, and a kind of light disorientation, as if the mind were slightly out of sync with the body. These symptoms appeared between 6 and 10 hours after exposure to the mist, in a fairly predictable manner. And here's the curious detail. The most consistent reports always came from people who were outside or had their windows open when the mist appeared. A nurse in Colorado reported that all the patients she treated that week with this condition said the same sentence: "It was like I caught the flu in minutes." But the flu tests came back negative, and the symptoms disappeared as quickly as they came, usually within 24 to 48 hours. What can cause such a uniform and temporary reaction? I looked into emergency hospital records in 3 affected cities. It's not easy to access this type of data, but some public monitoring systems still allow you to view the volume of visits, even without exposing names. What I found was a clear anomaly. In the nights and mornings following the appearance of the mist, hospitals recorded a sudden spike in patients with respiratory and sensory complaints. Nothing extreme, no one in serious condition, but a statistically abnormal increase. Coincidence? I went further and consulted specialists. A toxicologist with experience in aerial dispersion told me something interesting. Certain chemical compounds, even in very small doses, can cause mild and temporary reactions, especially when inhaled in open environments. Most leave no detectable traces in standard tests, and the symptoms disappear before raising any medical red flags. The question he left hanging was, if someone wanted to test a population's reaction to an inhalable substance, what would be the best way to do it? And then comes a troubling pattern. Doctors who tried to report these occurrences as something unusual began to face pressure. One of them, who treated about 20 patients in Arizona, gave an anonymous interview saying he was instructed not to raise environmental hypotheses. Another, in Houston, reported that all the medical records were reclassified by the hospital system as mild viral illness. Not by mistake, by order. Who would be interfering in this kind of protocol? There was no officially declared outbreak. No epidemiological investigation was launched. But curiously, all the affected regions began to be discreetly visited by federal teams. In at least 2 counties, vans with the Department of Health logo were seen collecting soil and water samples days after the mist. No press release, no public notice. Does that seem like standard protocol for a harmless atmospheric phenomenon? In one of the cities, a volunteer from the CDC's disease tracking system, a program called BioSense, reported that when he tried to register local residents' symptoms, he received an internal notice that the event category was already under federal review. This means there was indeed an investigation underway, but it wasn't public. Why keep something like this secret? Another striking detail: in closed forums for doctors, some professionals began to report a curious pattern. The symptoms didn't follow the typical viral profile. The fever was low and fleeting. The headache appeared as a localized pressure behind the eyes, and the nausea came without other gastric signs. One clinician even said it seemed more like a reaction to anesthetic gases than to an infection. But no tests pointed to any substance. Are we facing a new disease, or a carefully calibrated exposure? No official medical bulletin mentioned this pattern. No university published a study. But the reports were there, repeating themselves state after state, and always in regions that, just days before, had been covered by an unusual mist. It may not be enough to point to a culprit, but it's impossible not to notice the structure that begins to form. And if it's not a coincidence, then what is it? With the symptoms mapped, records altered, and silent investigations, the impression is that someone wanted to test something and measure the collective response without raising alarm. But test what, exactly? And what would they do with the data? If you've never heard of Operation Sea Spray, now is the time to pay attention. In 1950, the United States Army conducted an experiment in San Francisco, releasing bacteria into the air, without the population's knowledge, to study how a biological agent could spread in a coastal city. This is not a theory. This is fact. It was publicly admitted decades later in official documents. And in that case, the symptoms reported among the population were mild, scattered, and difficult to trace. Sound familiar? The parallel with what happened in January 2025 is impossible to ignore. At the time of Sea Spray, the government also initially claimed that everything was within safety parameters. Only later was it revealed that one man died and several others were hospitalized with rare infections. And when we begin to cross-reference that history with the patterns of the recent mist, mild symptoms, silent dispersion, lack of convincing explanations, it becomes hard not to raise the hypothesis that we're witnessing an updated version of that same strategy. And there's more. During the 1960s and 70s, several other similar experiments came to light. Operation LAC, large area coverage, for example, involved the spraying of particles over rural and urban areas in the US to test the reach of agents on a large scale. In all these cases, the pattern repeated itself. The government claimed to be testing detection systems, but only admitted to the use of substances after public pressure or leaked documents. Why did so many tests have to happen without public consent? With technological advances, the need for aircraft and ground teams has diminished. Today, a fleet of autonomous drones is enough to do the job, more precisely, faster, and almost undetectably. This makes the comparison even more unsettling. If in 1950 it was possible to spray an entire city with a docked ship, what would stop someone in 2025 from doing the same with silent drones and a fog that vanishes in under an hour? Some argue that it would be illegal. And it is. But sea spray was illegal too. So was LAC. History shows that legality has never been a real obstacle when it comes to defense research and population control. The real question is, did those tests end, or just change form? Digging through declassified documents and records from US congressional hearings, I found at least 3 mentions, between 2009 and 2017, of controlled atmospheric simulation projects conducted by the Department of Defense. The program names are technical, full of jargon. But the essence is clear: to study how airborne elements behave in densely populated areas. One of them, called Project Basalt, was mentioned in a closed hearing about urban resilience in unconventional risk contexts. What exactly does that mean? Another interesting point: some of the laboratories involved in sea spray are still active today, and curiously, 2 of them published articles in January 2025 denying any connection between pollutants and the respiratory symptoms reported at the time of the mist. The problem? These articles were published before complete hospital visit data had even been released. How do you explain such urgency in dismissing hypotheses? And here comes an uncomfortable coincidence. The same institutions that took part in the old tests are now the ones helping shape the official narrative about FOGVID-24. Respected institutions bearing scientific credibility. But when viewed through the lens of history, they've been wrong before or withheld relevant information. This is not an accusation. It's a reminder. Credibility does not exclude responsibility. Many people might ask, but why would they do this now, in the age of information? Precisely because of that. It has never been easier to manipulate what is seen, searched, and shared. A silent test today can be covered up in real time. All it takes is control of the platforms, the algorithms, the permitted terms. When the story is told by those who also have the power to erase it, what is left for the public? That's why, looking at this scenario, it's hard to believe we're just facing a meteorological coincidence. The past left traces, documents, and silent victims. If the methods have evolved, who's to say the objectives haven't remained the same? When the first official statements emerged, shortly after the mist spread across 4 states, the explanation came in unison: thermal inversion. It was practically an automatic response, repeated by meteorologists in newspapers, by public agencies, and in regional press releases. But if you've read technical reports on thermal inversions, you know they have very specific preconditions. They don't just appear anywhere, at the same time, with identical behavior, and certainly not with a chemical odor. That's where a point few people notice comes in. In the days leading up to the mist, some independent climate monitoring stations, those operated by universities and volunteers, detected unusual changes in the ionosphere's electromagnetic patterns. And these changes occurred precisely over the regions where the mist appeared. Coincidence? Perhaps. But there's a name that always surfaces when the topic is atmospheric manipulation. HAARP. HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, is a real facility, established in the 1990s in Alaska, with the declared objective of studying the ionosphere. It uses high-frequency transmissions to excite particles in the upper atmosphere. According to its own documents, the research helps improve communications and radar systems. However, for years, independent scientists and researchers have questioned just how far the real application of this technology goes. And here comes a technical but important detail. The type of frequency used by HAARP is capable of temporarily altering the ionosphere's density. This, in turn, can affect meteorological phenomena. In 2014, an internal document from the program, obtained via the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, indicated that one possible application would be to test how these alterations influence cloud and fog formation at lower altitudes. They never said they did it, but they clearly stated it could be done. On January 3rd, 4th, and 5th, 2025, exactly before the mist, radio frequency sensors picked up unusual pulses of high-frequency waves in the atmospheric belt over the American Southwest. Some of this data came from amateur stations and shortwave radios, which began reporting interference. The disruptions were brief but strong, the kind of signal that doesn't appear without cause. If HAARP, or a similar station, was active on those days, would that make sense? And let's not forget, the original HAARP is no longer the only one. Since the 2000s, countries like Russia and China have developed their own versions with similar purposes. There are comparable facilities in Canada, Northern Europe, and even proposals for miniaturization via atmospheric balloons. Today, modifying small climatic zones in a localized way is not only possible, it's viable, tested, and silent. The problem is that, publicly, no one admits this. Meteorology still treats the weather as if it's 100% natural, even with all the technologies that already interfere with it daily. From artificial clouds in China to geoengineering tests aimed at fighting global warming. If we're already openly creating rain, what else might be happening out of public view? Now imagine this. What if a specific frequency applied to a strategic point in the atmosphere could help stabilize the mist, preventing it from dispersing as it normally would? That would explain why it remained still, low to the ground, and then suddenly dissolved. It would be a combination of chemical dispersion and atmospheric manipulation, far beyond a natural phenomenon. It would be quite literally a manufactured fog. Of course, none of this was mentioned in official statements. No agency brought up electromagnetic pulses, atmospheric radar, or any anomalies in climate data. Yet the records are there, and they were ignored by virtually all major media. Don't you find it strange that no one, in any interview, even considered this possibility? When institutional silence is combined with data pointing to active interference, the tone of the situation changes. And all of this leads us to wonder, what if the goal wasn't just to test substance dispersion, but also to manipulate how and where those substances behave within the atmosphere? The mist may have been only the visible effect of something much larger and far more calculated. While many people focused on the deleted videos and unregistered drones, another clue was running under the radar, invisible to the general public but clear behind the scenes of public health. Hospital databases didn't match people's accounts. It wasn't a small discrepancy, it was a pattern. And when I carefully analyzed this data, I realized the story was being told twice, one version on the streets, another in official systems. Platforms like NEDS, National Emergency Department Sample, and Essence, from the CDC itself, allow for tracking increases in specific symptoms across different regions. They don't reveal names, but they show trends, number of visits, age groups, symptom types. And in this data, one thing stood out. Between January 6th and 10th, there was an abrupt rise in reports of mild and nonspecific respiratory symptoms in at least 12 counties across the 4 states affected by the mist. But here comes the strange part. In at least 4 of these counties, the records for respiratory illness were marked as unspecified viral cases, even when lab tests had been performed and came back negative. In other words, the system said it was a viral infection, but the test results contradicted that conclusion. Is this a documentation error or a deliberate decision? I spoke with a hospital IT technician who works directly with these systems. He explained that many hospitals use automated codes to speed up patient classification, but those codes can be modified by external guidelines coming from state administrations or the CDC. And here's an important discovery. On January 5th, one day before the first mist report, an internal memo was issued in at least 2 Arizona hospitals, instructing staff to standardize mild respiratory symptoms as unspecified viral syndrome. Do you understand what that means? The instruction came before the symptoms had spread, and it didn't come from a doctor. It came from management. So the obvious question is, why was there such a specific directive for a condition that, until then, didn't exist on a national scale? Another curious detail lies in the BioSense system, which monitors diseases in real time. It integrates data from thousands of hospitals and clinics across the country. Between January 7th and 9th, the system flagged a spike in patient visits with an unusual pattern. The technical note entered for that spike was uncategorized event, continuous monitoring. This happens when symptoms are atypical and don't fit known categories. But no bulletin was released. No alert went to the press. Nothing was made public. I also spoke with a hospital data analyst who had worked with the CDC. He confirmed that in some cases, sensitive data is marked as confidential or under internal review to avoid premature backlash. And that's acceptable, as long as the data eventually comes to light. But to this day, nothing about that spike has been disclosed. What were they waiting for? For curiosity to fade? And it's not just a matter of numbers. When you begin to analyze the medical codes used, like our 05.9 for unspecified cough, or J06.9 for acute upper respiratory infection of unspecified site, you notice they were used excessively during that period, as if they had been applied to cover up more complex symptoms. A doctor might be trained to investigate. An automated system is not. From what I was able to gather, no healthcare unit collected air samples during the times when the mist was present. Not a single one. That means that today, officially, there is no technical data on the mist's composition in hospitals. If there was no risk, why not measure it? And if there was, why not act? In the end, it's not that the data doesn't exist. It does. It's there. But it's been classified, labeled, and organized in a way that makes it nearly impossible to trace any direct connection to the phenomenon. And when the structure of the records seems designed to erase traces, instead of clarifying them, we need to ask, are we facing a systemic failure or a well-calculated silence? When we lay everything side by side, the mist with abnormal behavior, the unregistered drones, the replicated symptoms across different states, the redirected medical data, the radio frequency logs, and the history of similar military tests, the scenario stops looking random. There is no official confession. No single piece of evidence solves the puzzle, but the coincidences repeat too often. And in investigations like this, when logic doesn't point to chance, omission begins to speak volumes. It could have been a natural phenomenon. It could, but if it was, why did the footage disappear? Why were the symptoms standardized? Why were the hospital records shaped not to raise suspicion? Why was there silence about the drones, the atmospheric pulses, the identical behavior patterns? When all these questions remain unanswered, the conclusion isn't about what exactly happened, but about who doesn't want us to find out. This story is just one piece, and one day, maybe you'll see the whole puzzle. If this made you think, subscribe and like the video. It helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share. After all, more voices mean more discoveries.